Evening, everyone, and welcome to the Costume Society of America's presentation of How to Research in an Archive. My name is Jenny Leigh Dupuis. I am a PhD student at Cornell University, and tonight I'll be your host for our discussion with three extraordinary guests, archivist experts Sara Idacavage, Marlies Shoney, and Jed Winokur. As part of tonight's presentation, we've developed an introductory resource sheet for you of suggested readings about archival research and object-based study, and that will be made available in the chat at the end of the session. Now, a brief introduction of each of our illustrious guests. Sara Idacavage is a fashion historian and current PhD student at the University of Georgia. Served as a fashion specialist for the New School Archives and Special Collections, and has worked with the Parsons Fashion Study Collection, corporate archives for designers such as Ralph Lauren, and is currently working with the Historic Clothing and Textile Collection at the University of Georgia. She has also taught courses on fashion history and research methods at Parsons, Pratt, and FIT. Marlies Shoney is the assistant curator at The Ohio State University Historic Costume and Textiles Collection and is an adjunct instructor of fashion history at the Columbus College of Art and Design. Her research interests include the relationship between gender and dress in the 19th century, dress reform, and the digitization of historic costume collections. Jed Winokur is building out and leading the fashion and retail vertical for Inwoven, a digital storytelling platform incubated by the New York Times, as well as having previously held the position of director of the Coach Archive and project manager and archivist for the Winthrop Group, where he worked on collections for such organizations as the Apollo Theater, the American Folk Museum, and the American Academy of Rome Archives in New York. During his graduate studies, Jed refined his skills through work with the Woody Guthrie Archive and the Guggenheim Museum collections, and was honored in 2016 with a Pratt Institute Alumni Achievement Award for his contributions to the field of archives. Thank you all for being here with us tonight. Now to our main event. We've divided the questions into three main areas: basic information about archives, conducting an archival research visit, and archives in the age of COVID. The audience is encouraged to ask questions via the chat function, and we will take some time at the end of the presentation to get those questions answered by our experts. Let's begin. So to our esteemed panelists, could you each please tell us a little bit about your experience and perspective as archivists and researchers? Let's start with Marlies, then Sara, then Jed, please.
Everyone, thanks for coming. And I think my experience as a researcher has been largely housed within the context of academic institutions, particularly large universities, being as I am at the Ohio State University land-grant institution. So a lot of mine is sort of research with the emphasis on education and sort of open access for students and other researchers to make collections as available as possible. So that's been the crux of a lot of my work. And so I tend to try to highlight and utilize other academic collections in order to sort of draw more attention to them for people who may not be aware that a lot of these artifacts are housed in university and college collections. I guess that's most of it. My experience is that I've worked in academic institutions teaching for about 12 years, and I've been an assistant curator at Ohio State for 10 years. Working under Gail Strege. And so it's a little bit different than if you're working in a fine art museum or a private collection, but for sure. But I think we'll talk about the differences there as we go through the rest of the evening.
Thank you, Marlies. Sara, you're next.
Hi, everybody. I'm legitimately so excited to be here. I'm obsessed with archives, and I always want to talk about them, but I don't think my husband wants to hear about them anymore, nor do my friends. So it's really cool to be with a bunch of people who chose to be here and have similar interests to me. And in case you can't tell from all my archival blue boxes, I'm basically living in an archive. But my experience first started in graduate school. I kind of, I guess, caught the bug or whatever you want to call it. I was just kind of recommended by a teacher to go check out the New School Archives, some collection that they had, and I fell in love instantly, and that ended up turning into my master's thesis. And because I was just so overly enthusiastic with that collection. The two archivists who work at the New School Archives, who have been there for a long time, Jenny and Wendy, who are like two of my favorite human beings, they hired me right out of grad school to actually catalog that same collection that I use for my research. So thank you, Wendy and Jenny, if you're in the audience. And then from there, I went on to work in some corporate archives like Jed. He has a lot of experience with that as well. And it wasn't for me, which we can talk about later. And then I started teaching at Parsons and Pratt and FIT. And when I was a teacher, I was always pushing my students to use archives as much as possible. And they never really did. So I'm hoping that maybe this webinar will kind of help make people less scared. And then now I'm back to being a PhD student, or I'm starting a PhD program this semester. So I'm kind of full circle. Very excited to be at the University of Georgia. But yeah, so I guess my perspectives, or what I hope to bring to this webinar, is just a little bit of everything. But thank you so much for having me.
Great, Sarah. Thank you so much. I like that you expressed that you're kind of living in an archive right now.
Yeah, I express like I'm in an archive just all the time.
I'm excited to pick your brain about that. Thank you so much. And last but not least, let's hear from Jed, please.
Hi, everyone. So I guess I would echo the sentiments of Sara and Marlies. Get to do so many different things in archives. There's so many different flavors, which is sort of what really drew me to it. And I got my master's at Pratt in the mid-2000s, and focused, actually originally thought I would kind of become a college librarian. And when I was there, I found archives, excuse me, and ended up interning at the Guggenheim. I was at the Newark Museum, and I think at that point just realized that's what I wanted to do. Kind of get your hands dirty a little bit. You're working with source material. It's a little bit of a treasure hunt, kind of put all these things together, and I realized, wow, this is really what I want to do. I interned at the Woody Guthrie Archive. Was really lucky. They were located in New York City at the time, and they were a wonderful archive because they were a living archive where they were doing so many active projects. Nora, Woody's daughter, oversaw the archive, and it just sort of had a big imprint on me of what you could do and how you could harness things for fun projects in the current kind of now. Then I graduated and I started working in consulting for the Winthrop Group. And my first job actually out of school was a political archive. And that was kind of stepping over into studying about something to working somewhere. And I was really interested to find out that I really enjoyed being, immersed even in like a political archive or something that I wouldn't have thought originally was something I wanted to do. And then I realized, oh yeah, that bug, it's there, and you get that human element, and you're working with source materials. And I got to do a lot of kind of figure out, like go into a lot of different archives, nonprofits, museums, business archives. And then I moved to Coach, and I was there for about 12 years. I oversaw their corporate archive. Again, there was sort of a treasure hunt piece there, which was really wonderful, of just collecting and kind of connecting the product with the stories and the printed ephemera, bringing things into the archive that we didn't have as part of the collection. And from there, I transitioned to working with Inwoven, which is actually a company that documents, digitally a way to collect and visually see all of the materials that would be locked away. So it's almost like a way to digitally storytell, which is what I was drawn to when I was at Coach, and I adopted it there. And I'm working with them to essentially help other companies do the same thing that I did at Coach. And I hope to, bring some interesting tidbits to the conversation. There's a lot of experience here, which is really fun. And it's always fun to talk about archives. So I'm excited to get started.
Thank you very much, Jed. While we have you, this next bit will be touching on the differences between the different kinds of archives that you all have worked in as a way to kind of introduce these to the audience. So, Jed, would you mind talking about your experiences? What is a corporate archive in the first place? What do you do there? How does it work? Can the public attend? Anything like that?
Sure. Yeah, our corporate archives, so Coach was the first object-based collection that I oversaw, which I was extremely excited about 12 years ago right now. And then when I got there, you kind of get to deal with all of the challenges that you're dealing with on an object level, because before that I was really just, folder level, box level. So a corporate archive is generally an internal resource. So I would say that's like the most fundamental difference between, say, an academic archive. And that meant that I worked primarily with, the employees of Coach, the designers. I reported up through design and work with them as they brought back new product, work with the creative teams on different initiatives, milestones or anniversaries, and still did everything behind the scenes that you would do as an archivist in terms of housing and rehousing and ensuring preservation. And but I also I was kind of the one that packaged the information for everyone too. So I got to be a researcher. So I would reach out to external institutions that had, say, collections on. So Bonnie Cashin was the creative director, really the piece that drew me to Coach, originally, and that I was so excited to kind of add to that story for everyone. So I went to, where her archive's located in UCLA. I befriended the owner of the Bonnie Cashin archive, Stephanie Lake, and, we just had kind of developed a really nice relationship with her. So get to wear a lot of different hats in a corporate archive, and it moves fast too. So that's something too, you're moving at the speed of whatever that business is. And, as we know in fashion, it's very fast, and calendars are moving at the speed of light. So kept me on my toes for 12 years for sure. But at the same time, there still were the pieces of the archive that I really enjoyed.
You mentioned the treasure hunt. I'm wondering if you could expand on what part of your job was a treasure hunt and how it worked.
Sure. About 2 or 3 years into the time that I was at Coach, started working with the PR team, and up to that point, the archive was just under lock and key. No one had seen it, and I believe that there was an article done in Vogue Japan, and they showed a picture of the archive, and that was kind of the opening up of the doors. And from there, everyone, was so excited about the archive, and a big talking point that we tended to talk about with the archive, because so this was like maybe 2011. Archives, I feel like it's become a word that is assimilated into natural language. When I originally went to become an archivist, my family was kind of like, what is an archivist? What is an archive? And I think it's kind of like a librarian, but we deal with unique, one-of-a-kind materials, original source materials. And I started doing a lot of collecting to build out the collection, which was something that we were doing before we were working with PR, but because we were working with PR, started to get a lot of calls, and were able to kind of essentially use old catalogs to buy back the things we didn't have, and kind of figure out what the branding was during the different eras. And I worked with a lot of different collectors who were very interested and very knowledgeable. And from that, and some of the source material that I had, we're able to sort of craft a collection policy to build out, say some of the decades from the 60s or 70s that we didn't have, a lot of. And, an archive's really about building for the future user. At the time when I was collecting, we weren't necessarily, as a brand, going back to those pieces, but once they were there, it instantly became a resource. So that was really kind of a rewarding, fun thing to see happen.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to Sara because I think she mentioned she has some corporate archive experience as well as some university. So we'll bridge from Jed into Sara and then Sara back into Marlies.
Okay, yes. Jed is just so good and eloquent at describing things. I'm really glad that he mentioned the speed and the calendar cycles, because I think that might have been sort of the challenging aspect for me when I was working in corporate archives. Granted, I guess I was lucky in that I was only doing special projects, so I wasn't like, 100% there. I kind of got to dip my toes in, see what that was like. But yeah, you're beholden to the designers and the shareholders. And I feel like there's, two different ways. One is preserving the legacy of the brand, of course, which Jed did a fantastic job for Coach, of course. And then on the other hand, they're kind of building a myth. And it's kind of weird because I guess as a historian and an academic, I like to try to see things more, I want to say objectively, but that's obviously impossible. But when you're in these designer archives, it's like, it's kind of funny to see just like, oh, they are kind of making up these stories about designers and trying to, set these legacies for years to come. So that's a little what makes it different. But then I think it's always every single type of archive I've worked in has been like a massive paradigm shift, because like the New School Archives and Special Collections is a very traditional, amazing university collection that's all about, ephemera. So it's like photographs and sketches and letters and recordings. It's not garments. And so I got a great kind of like, crash course into library sciences through that job. And then my other jobs ended up being more clothing based. And so I also was working with the Parsons Fashion Study Collection years later. So yeah, it is kind of funny when and then of course with the study collection, some people would call it an archive, like the Parsons one, everyone would refer to it as an archive, but with an archive, you're not usually letting lots of students like touch it constantly. So it's a little hard if you have an archivist training to actually work in a study collection, because you're like, oh my God, stop touching these things. But like, you do want to try to preserve things for as long as possible, but at the same time, the entire purpose of it is for education. So you have to kind of weigh the pros and cons and just kind of, manage the risks there. So yeah, did I answer your question, Jenny? Sorry, I got really excited talking about the so.
You did. And before we talk about your experience then in university collections, we do have a question from the audience from Colleen. How common are corporate archives? I've worked for several large fashion companies, and our archives, in quotes, were literal basements full of crap with no organization. Are they more common in high-end brands?
Ooh, well, I think Jed and I could probably both speak to this, because for pretty much any American fashion brand, I know someone who's worked with their archive. Just being in New York City, well, I'm not there anymore, but we're a very tight-knit group of archive nerds. And I think a lot of companies, they have it, but they might not know what to do with it. And without sounding terribly negative, it's such an investment. And when you have a fashion company, it's about revenue, right? It's like, what is generating revenue? And so often the archive is not the direct correlation to what's doing sales. So to your point about, basements full of crap with no organization, yeah, it makes sense, because it really is down to the bottom line. And when you have to cut corners and you have to fire staff, sadly, the archive is typically the first thing to go. And then also at universities, some universities, not mine. Go UGA, UGA is great, but in general, it's just sort of the reality. But I don't know, Jed, do you want to add more to these sort of hidden corporate archives?
I think that was a really great answer, and I would maybe just to add to it this idea of a name, whether it's a brand or it's an institution or it's a museum. I know when I was in school, I thought they must have wonderful archives, but the reality is archives are generally in the attic or the basement. They're not funded, they're ignored, and that just seems to be common practice. And there is a lot of storytelling around it, but sometimes the story doesn't reflect what you see when you actually get behind the scenes. So for every successful archive, and I'm sure that people are following archives and archivists on LinkedIn and people that are involved with social, there's a lot of publicity there and kind of working with the leadership to get support. So as leaders are coming and going, there's a constant re-education, there's a constant need to show some way that ROI, that return on investment, which is really tough, in an archive. And it extends not even just from a corporate or a fashion archive, I would say. It's really across the board. We see the inherent value in archives, but so much of it then becomes about the communication piece, I would say. So for all of those literal basements full of crap, I would say, well, that's an opportunity for someone who's fresh out of school and wants to kind of make it work for them at that, that company or that institution, because if the story is good enough and if the pieces are good enough, there's going to be an interest there. And then that can become essentially someone's role, hopefully, or a piece of someone's role, maybe. That's the goal, right?
That's great. Thank you very much. We have a comment from one of the organizers. In the past 5 to 10 years, brands have been more and more conscious of saving items for their archives, and they specify that smaller brands. Does that kind of line up with what you have seen in your corporate experience?
Yes, absolutely. And I think Jed would agree. Just kind of the time frame that you started working with Coach seems to match up. And I've had the opportunity to talk to archivists for brands like Chanel, and they have maybe been a little bit more experienced with it. But for the most part, American brands, I mean, we're babies, right? Like as a country, we're like babies. We're still like figuring things out. There's no such. I have a friend who works for Tommy Hilfiger. I know she always talks about like, what is an American heritage brand? We're still so new. There's nothing that really goes back, farther than 50 years for the most part. I mean, Coach is one of the older ones. So it does seem like a lot of more people are becoming aware of it, which I think has something to do with social media and seeing the different brands that have it, and just seeing, an institution like Marlies there. Like, I think brands see that there is a opportunity for some publicity, right? And I think a lot of actually corporate archives end up being in the marketing department. I've definitely seen that before. Some friends who worked with amazing library like archives, and they're like, oh, I'm technically in the PR for this brand, because that's how they see it. They see it as a way to promote. And then also with corporate brands, they lend things out for photo shoots for people to wear on the red carpet. So that's also, it does serve them well, I think. But then there's, I guess, a quick shout out to Julianne Klaus. She runs The Wardrobe, which is a company that gets hired by different designers to build their archives. I know she began, I believe, with Tom Ford, and I got to work with her for a while. And so she's been very forward thinking, I believe, in approaching different designers and being like, here's what's up. You got to preserve your legacy. And so I think, people like her are the reason why, because there's, again, like what Jeff was saying, like right out of school, there's more and more people in the workforce because we're churning out tons of master's students and PhD students, and they got to work somewhere, right? So.
Yes. Thank you. We have a couple more questions about corporate archives from the audience, and then we're going to move along so we can keep the train rolling. Do any of the panelists have experience with or advice for tracking down corporate archives for businesses that no longer exist or were folded into larger corporations? And that's from Adam.
Assuming it's not a sad story where if the company folded and the archive kind of disappeared, it could be a long and arduous treasure hunt. I would say contacting the company, speaking to what Sara was saying about companies starting to understand the need to save the things that they've created or in that history. I think that there is some preservation going on even outside of brands, say that are active. So some of these folded brands are being kind of saved and retained in-house, and that's a big part of just when there's a designer with their namesake and the name is used to a certain point, the question of where that archive goes. If it's not a university and it's with a company, it would just be kind of trying to get in touch with people and just being persistent, I would say.
Yeah, I think you'd be surprised by how many of these collections end up being privately owned. I know the Bonnie Cashin collection was, I'm not sure who the woman is, but I know my friend Kim is gotten to you. I think her name's Stephanie, but she just
Stephanie,
she had like a Bonnie Cashin archive in her basement, like a person. So I also sometimes will go into like books about a designer or a brand and see if it references a person or, you know, some sort of relevant institution, because like maybe some super random, you know, large scale brand, maybe it exists at this tiny little university somewhere, you never know. So it is kind of a lot of like, yeah, tracking down, a little bit of detective work is needed.
And that sounds like it's tying back into the treasure hunt that Jed was mentioning before. For our last question about corporate archives, if objects from corporate archives are scanned or digitized, are any of them put online for other scholars to see or study? And that's from Elizabeth.
I mean, I would probably say the archivist would love to do that. However, you know, because it's an internal resource, generally no, unless they're, you know, on the corporate, you know, website, there's a link to archives and there's a kind of a little bit of a taste there of just, you know, kind of a story about the brand. Maybe there's a link to reaching out to the archive, or maybe their email is just archive@brand.com. Maybe that's one of my tips. I would try kind of reaching out in that sort of a way. I know, I believe, probably still, I should probably go onto my SAA profile. I just had my company email address there. So if there is an archivist, you can kind of search a business directory and try to get in touch with them. I mean, archivists are generally really nice. Which is something that I've really liked about the industry. Like when I moved into it, like everyone wants to share knowledge, they want to share experiences. Within corporate archives, there is a sense of closed collection, but that's only as true as, you know, as anything is true, really. You know, you can still, you know, communicate with the archivist and find out what the situation is and try to kind of weasel your way in, and maybe you can, you know, process a collection or intern or do something that, you know, they're looking to have kind of surveyed, and part of that could just be using it for a research paper or, you know, part of like a thesis or something.
And on that note, do you often, or in your experience, have you often worked with students who are looking at items from your corporate archives?
Well, from my experience just working in them, I mean, I wasn't necessarily managing appointments and stuff, but I know it was really hard for the students to use it. It was so built for the designers and the marketing team that having a student come in, they had to do all these non-disclosure agreements. It was like a big deal. So unfortunately, and I think it also has to do with you know, funding. They can't really afford to be, you know, bringing all these students in and dropping their work and doing it. So I think it's a little bit more difficult, but I think Jed did also shine a little hope that, yeah, archivists are nice and we're nerds and we want to share our information. So you should reach out and see what can happen. But for the most part, yeah, I've found that corporate archives, they just don't have the bandwidth maybe to work with a lot of students, which is why university archives are so fantastic.
What a great way to transition into speaking about the university archives. Thank you for setting that up. I'd love to hear about your experiences working with them before you went back to school and now as a student working with the UGA archive.
Okay, so not to suck up to my previous or current bosses, but I do think university archives are number one. I think Marlies can agree with me because typically they're there to share knowledge. You know, there's not a whole lot of extra agenda to it. There's not like the museum kind of sphere, which can be very political. The corporate sphere, however, we talked about that being sort of geared towards the fashion calendar. But with the university archive, it's typically like, let's educate, right? So that's my favorite part. But yeah, I mean, I guess just kind of in a very general sense, it is kind of funny being back now as a student, because I'm not doing a lot of archival research at UGA per se, but going to other institutions, because right now I'm sort of studying the evolution of consumption norms. So I'm looking at things like etiquette books and how-to books and how women were told to purchase clothes, take care of them, as well as like US Department of Agriculture census records of clothing expenditures. But it's so unorganized and it's so hard to find, and it's just like, I want to organize it. I want to hire someone to do this for you. But then I understand, like, oh, they probably don't have any money and no funding. So it is, I am feeling a little bit of the stress, and then also I'm just not having the time. You know, I think that's the one thing about archives, which we'll probably talk about with the whole digital versus in person, is that there's never enough time to use it. There's a lot of burnout. We're on Zoom all day long. I mean, I'm like barely able to look at my screen right now after a full day, but yeah, so I am finding it, in some ways, I appreciate it more now that I've had that professional experience, but then I'm also like, man, there's a lot to get done, and it's never enough time or money.
Hopefully we can help to alleviate a little bit of the Zoom burnout with this this very fun topic that we have to end our days with. So I'd like to bring Marlies back. If we could hear from Marlies about your perspective running the collection and working as an educator with students in a university archive.
Sorry, I accidentally muted myself again. I think, you know, what's interesting about university archives too, and it's worth pointing out, and this is true of a museum as well, it really depends on the university, and it depends on how it's housed. It's funny, you know, the thing Gail and I always talk about with OSU is you tell people you're at the Ohio State University and they're like, wow, you must have all this funding, and then you laugh and you laugh. So, I mean, I think the hardest thing about museum collections, kind of to what Jed was saying, is the struggle to make sure people know you're there. Because a lot of times they're hidden and buried under decades of sort of restructuring of a college. You know, so for the example at Ohio State, we began a long time ago. The collection is 100 years old, but it started in what was the College of Home Economics and is now the College of Education and Human Ecology. And then you sub that to the Department of Consumer Science, then you sub that to the Fashion Retail Studies program, and then there we are. So it's just sort of, I think the trick with university collections is no matter how big you are, because we're a pretty massive collection, you know, we have over 12,000 artifacts, which is pretty big. And I've had fashion retail students come to me their senior year and go, I didn't know you were in here. And I want to just throttle them, but it's not their fault. So I think the hardest part with university collections is oftentimes finding them, because they maybe don't exist where you think they're going to exist. And honestly, in terms of getting access to them and sort of how they interpret their objects and present them can depend on where they're housed. There's a distinct difference between something that's housed in an art school and is attached to a design program than something that is sort of housed in a retail studies program or merchandising program that's housed more in like that home ec background. I mean, I would say, and that's true of museums as well. So there's a difference when you work with curators and collections in terms of access and what kinds of things they collect. If you're looking at like an art museum, like there's a massively wonderful collection at the Cincinnati Art Museum versus something that's maybe housed at a historical society, you know, and that's a difference within the profession of maybe like an art curator versus a natural history or anthropology curator. So, I mean, I think in terms of presenting it in terms of education, I have found in my experience that if I want professors to use the collection, I basically have to sort of hand them a lesson. I can't just say, hey, we have this great archive you could be using in your class. It's very specific, like, hi, here's this entire lesson I've built for you using the archive, and you can just put it into your class, because it's really hard, I think, sometimes for people, like, and you take it for granted, because for me, I was trained, my background is totally in history. My BA's in history, my master's is in history. So for me, like, I was trained as like a narrative sort of social historian. So for me, it's like using objects as totally normal. Like, you're just sort of like, yes, it's better to show a thing. But for other people, it's really hard, because it's sort of like trying to teach them how to read an object if you've only ever read paper. And so I think if you're trying sometimes to get professors or students, there's that initial sort of training of them of how to look at an actual object and use it. And yeah, I would say in terms of getting into university collections, don't give up, they're there. It's always best if you can't find them, ask someone you do know in a university collection, because I guarantee we know where they are, because we have stalked them all before. Yeah, is there any, I guess is that work?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit more about how you work with students who are looking to, say, use an object from the collection for a research project. How would they start that process?
Good question. First of all, and I think Sarah was speaking to this, when I have students contact me, I freak out internally because I try to keep that crazy inside, but I get really excited because there's nothing I love more than having people use it, because to me, I think it's the best thing ever, and I want other people to know it's the best thing ever. What I would do typically, and especially now with COVID, I will speak to the fact that for my university, in terms of trying to mitigate spread, we are not allowed on campus very often. I'm only allowed into the building to work with my collection physically on hand 1 day a week. So right now, the best way to get a hold of people is through email, and be very patient if people don't get back to you right away, because I can speak to me, like, again, I don't check it necessarily every single day because, like many other people, I'm at home, like quasi homeschooling my kids. So give everybody, I'm sure everybody does, but just give them grace and patience. I would say try to find out, and this is the order of operations I would take. I would find the collection, I would find who the staff is. If there's a collection manager, email them first. If there's not a collections manager, email the assistant curator. And if there's not an assistant curator, email the curator, because generally that's the order of the gatekeeping. So if there is a collections manager, they're probably the one that's going to be pulling artifacts for you and setting up the date and times for you to come in. And generally, if there's not a collections manager, it's then the assistant. And if there's not an assistant and there's just that one curator, which is true of many university collections, they're the person who's going to be doing sort of gatekeeping for you. And they're generally very happy and excited. I would say for me, if you're going to go into an archive, please come in with a very specific question. I do get frustrated with students who are like, I want to study the 1960s. And I'm like, that's 500 objects. Like, can you narrow it down? And I'm willing to work with them, like over email or through a phone conversation, to sort of narrow their topic down. I don't mind doing that, but just know you can't go into an archive, because you can't just like wander the stacks like in a library, which I think is sort of something that people have to learn. We know that, but like, I have to pull the things for you. You're welcome to see them. I'll stand there with you with a pair of gloves, and you can have a pair of gloves, and man, we can look at how that thing's made together, but I can't have you just like walking up and down going, that's pretty. So I think always have a very specific research question. If you don't know what that should be yet and you need help with that, that's cool. You can ask us, because we are also here as educators. So if you need help narrowing that down, that's great. But yeah, I would notify people in that order. And I always, whenever I go out to speak to different courses, because I've sort of insinuated myself into about 3 or 4 different classes in the history department at OSU, because I like to think of myself as delightfully pushy. So I've done that. So whenever I go over there, I'm very like in their face about the fact that here is my phone number, here is my email. You need to come use me as a resource. So I do get some of them that way. So I think we also are trying to promote out on things like Instagram and Snapchat and like anything, and that's, God bless them. If you don't know how to do that, and I'm 37, I like to think I'm marginally hip, but I'm not. Nothing is better than having student volunteers or interns do your social media for you, because they're into it and they're like, I have this great idea, and I'm like, go, do it. Which is a great way for students to get in and get to know the collection. I've had students do that, and then they come back and want to learn more about the actual archival process, which is really cool. But yeah, I think in terms of working with students, I will work with students from any department. I've had students from English creative writing come and just sort of like want to be inspired by clothing from the Romantic era to sort of do a project. And I'm like, great, here, sit in front of these 4 gowns and just be. And that's fine. So I think in terms of getting into university collections, we're generally very accessible. Don't be afraid to ask, and just show enthusiasm. Like, don't feel like you have to be super duper formal. I'd say usually what I do is I approach people with a certain degree of like formality on the first go, get a read of how they react to you, and then just, you know, we're people, so don't worry. And we were you. If you're a student now or if you're a recent student, like, we want to help you, because we, at least for me, like back when I did my master's in 05, you know, you had to physically call people, and that was hell. I don't like the call. but it was harder then, I think, because you couldn't internet stalk people. But I think just don't be afraid to ask. Whatever I tell my students, my best advice is like the worst anyone will ever tell you is no, and that's not that bad.
Exactly. So I would like to, there are two things I would like to touch on here. The first is your mention of the local historical societies. I need to give a shout out to a class I'm taking right now at Cornell. Dr. Denise Green is doing a class called Curating Fashion Exhibitions, and she recently brought in Dr. Arlisa Shepard from Buffalo State as a guest speaker. And Arlisa had amazing things to say about the work she was able to do with local historical societies, just having cool stuff that was relevant to her research. So shout out to both of you for those. And I'd like to take what Marlies just said about the ask, basically, your first approach, setting up a research visit. And I'd like to go back to Sara and Jed and see if you have anything to add about how to put together your ask.
I do, and I got so excited I almost interrupted you. I'm sorry about that, Jenny. But just kind of jumping off of what Marlies said, I mean, from the times that I have been working with students and taking appointments, more often than not, it's true that the request is, I want to study the 1960s, and it's very exhausting, and I'm happy to go back and forth, but as an initial step, that is hard. And if there's any sort of beginning hint that you can give that archivist of what you're interested in, that's great. But the one thing I would suggest to any students or archive researchers in the audience is to also mention what you're working on. So I felt like half of the time when a student would say something that was, far too broad, I would ask, well, what is your assignment? And as soon as I heard that assignment, I was like, aha, okay, I got you. And then on top of that, sometimes just including your interests. So you could ask for things, but then be like, by the way, I'm also super into queer studies or something like that. And then all of a sudden I have, an enormous rich information that I can kind of already add to what I would have suggested in the first place. So I just wanted to add those two things.
Those are great. And Jed, do you have anything to add to this about the ask in the first place?
I mean, going off of that idea of a broad kind of question, if you think about where you are as a student, you're really in a very broad place. And if you don't understand how specific an archive can be, I think just knowing that you can talk to the archivist, if there's anyone that's written about materials in the archive, I guarantee you the archivist knows more than that person because they've worked with the pieces and they've really been around them. So, if you're looking to publish, the archivist is probably your new best friend because the things that they have in their head that they're excited to share about are essentially that source material that you can use to explore and kind of create your own vantage point, because they probably don't have time to go write about what they know because they're so busy with what they're trying to kind of get all their ducks in a row.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I have a little tidbit to add. I just did my first huge research project in an archive in January before you couldn't travel anymore. I went down to the Ringling Museum archives, and I did one of those cold emails where I was really nervous to contact them, but the info was right there on their public website. So I just sent my email, explained my research project, and they said, we'd love to have you. That's very broad. Can you narrow it down? So everything that all of you are saying is, from a student perspective, is very true. It's best to go in with a very specific thing, but also when I inform them of what my research project was about, all of a sudden there were 5,000 other things that they had that I could look at. So I'd like to transition into, we've already covered, I have some basic questions here, but we've already covered a lot of this information. So just to flesh a couple of things out, can we talk a little bit about what kinds of resources are available in, say, a fashion or a historical dress archive? And this is open to everyone, all three of you, please.
Well, usually not a lot of resources because of funding. Objects, yes, but research tools, maybe not so much. And that's, I don't want to be like the party pooper or anything, but you know, typically there's amazing objects and there's amazing human beings who work there. And then as much as there's space or, you know, tools or supplementary materials, that is where it gets tricky. That gets with, you know, available space and funding. So I guess I don't know how to specifically answer your question because it could be so different in every single place, but always the most valuable resource is the human beings who work there. As Judd said, you know, they are touching those objects, they are thinking about them all the time. And that's how I really got my master's research started, was from, again, the wonderful women, Wendy and Jenny, just me talking about my interests, and then they became my new best friends. And so, yeah, it's worth it.
I would say within a university collection, at least at Ohio, at least in my experience with several of them, there are a lot of resources. They may not be in one place. So the thing with, I can speak to from my home organization at OSU, and I have found at other colleges, we have a limited, I would say, like paper archive in terms of whether it's fashion periodicals or first-person articles or things like that. I have a lot of primary source objects related to garments in my collection, so personal family photographs, receipts, diaries, and things like that. I have those. But in terms of other things, I have them, per se, as a person at OSU. So, for example, there might be something that is held over in our rare books library collection, which is next door, or our Theater Research Institute, which is our theater history archive, that's next door in the library. There's a massive photo collection within university archives. You know, if you were researching John Glenn, I have some of Annie Glenn's clothes in my collection, and the John Glenn archives has John Glenn's clothing and many of his documents, and I've had researchers work with both of us to try to get that full story. So I think in terms of what I house in our university building is very limited primarily to sort of traditional fashion history objects and maybe things related personally to some of the donors. There's other information, and I usually try to direct people very specifically to those other curators and archivists in order to get them those other sort of supporting documents. So if you want to think of it as all being in-house, it is. You just might have to walk, you know, across the quad.
I mean, to add to that, I would just say, yeah, that idea of connecting sort of the objects with the donor materials or the ephemeral, you know, pieces that came with it, tends to be that piece of the puzzle that's sort of the aha moment, I would say, for people that are there, either as an experience, you know, visiting the archive or researching, because that's really where those objects start to have sort of a greater story than just as the historical object. And so, you know, those pieces, I would say, like, try to seek those out if you can. See, you know, what kind of finding aids there are that connect certain things. If there's a collections database, maybe ask for, you know, a list of the objects beforehand. I mean, you'll get a little teeny, probably thumbnail picture, but get out your magnifying glass and try to narrow things down and look for advice and try to connect some of those pieces together, because that, to me, is where, you know, that archive starts to become alive, and it can, you know, really speak to, you know, people in that kind of exciting way that an archive can, right? You know, a lot of books waiting to be written, but, you know, those connections take a lot of work, get dirty, and, you know, that's sort of the fun of it too. You know, you don't really just have everything presented to you like when you type in a Google search, you know, and that's, I think, sort of the essence of an archive. A lot of it is sort of the fun, positive piece and sort of that treasure hunt idea, but it also comes with its kind of challenges too.
You mentioned the aha moment of making these connections. I'd love to hear from each of you about an aha moment that you may have had, putting some pieces of the puzzles together or finding real treasure buried in your archive somewhere. So not to put you all on the spot, but I'm totally putting you all on the spot.
Okay, I guess I'll get started because I am addicted to that aha moment. I think that's what's kept me in archives for so long, because thank you, Marlies, for clapping. don't want to put myself in a bad light, but it's like an addiction. It really is kind of like this like endorphin or serotonin rush. It's kind of like gambling. You spend so many days and so many hours looking through things, and then you might find that one golden thing, and that was worth it. Or you might not find anything. So that is just a little confession, but hopefully other people can relate. And then as far as finding that one aha moment, I guess kind of going back to my master's thesis, the impetus for that, or the catalyst for that, I was just kind of told to look at this collection of sketches that an American dress manufacturer had accumulated from going to the Paris couture shows between the 1920s and the 1960s. I was just kind of going through and I was like, okay, this is not terribly unique. I've seen these things before. And I was looking at sort of newspaper clippings within this collection where they were like, during World War II, they were saying, his name was Herbert Sondheim. They were saying Herbert Sondheim is the ultimate American designer and he doesn't need French stuff. And he was kind of used by the government as like a talking head for like, go American fashion. We don't need the French. The French don't understand us. But then I was looking at the same year in his archival collection because these records did belong to him personally. And he was like, okay, for this season, copy all of the Chanel from 1930. And I was just like, oh, wait a minute here. There is something to be said that, this man is being used to promote American fashion. At the same time, I have physical proof that he was still relying on French fashion. And that kind of led to the bigger questions of like, well, how many other people were doing this? And even though it's just kind of this small thing, it just sort of troubled the idea of American fashion or the myth of it that I had in my head. And so that was a very exciting thing. But there's just so many. Like I said, I'm addicted to them, so I cannot name them all. But it's a great feeling. And you guys in the audience, like, go to an archive just to experience that. It's so worth it.
I can go next. I think, that maybe it's the beginning of sort of the creation of brand romance, right? And sort of what the perceptions are for fashion houses versus what the original stories are. And I love the original stories. I think there's so much context to that. I would probably say, like, in terms of like corporate archive experience when I was at Coach, there was a big portion of the collection that just existed in catalogs. But it was the 2010s. There was eBay, there was Etsy, and I was able to track down, and kind of had this mental list in my head of like a top 10 of these really rare things. Was able to track down and build out like whole decades, really. The 40s and the 50s when we were making men's product, when Coach was making men's product. The 60s when Bonnie Cashin was there, the 70s, as she was there and then transitioned. And I was able to get them kind of at flea market prices, which was kind of fun because people didn't know the story wasn't out yet. So there was sort of I guess that rush that Sara is talking about, this idea of like being there first and just being able to collect it. And then once it was gathered, a lot of that information was shared, and it's, kind of, it's common knowledge now among collectors, but there was a moment there where I was able to kind of put that collection together in a way that, it was fun to see it start to grow until it kind of got to a point where I was like, oh, now it's a collection. So that was a kind of a fun kind of just putting connections together and creating something in terms of buying something back and creating a renewable resource in the archive there at Coach.
Thank you, Jed. Marlise, any aha moments with students or anything from your experience?
I can think of one student one that was really interesting for me. I had a student in public health who contacted the collection. It was interested if we had any artifacts that spoke to sort of clothing related to disabilities. So anything that was sort of adaptive clothing or something like that. And I didn't really know, but I remembered that we had a pair of women's boots from the 1890s that had very significantly different heights of heels, like markedly different. And I thought about that and I said, you know what, I might, but let me get back to you. And so then I started sort of looking through the family history, And there was nothing in the donor file that explained it, but I sort of found out, they said who it belonged to, and I sort of dug through census records and newspaper clippings and found that the woman who had owned and worn them had had a sort of horrific horseback riding incident as a child, and so had permanent damage in her legs. So her legs were significantly different lengths. And so then I was able to give that to them, and they actually used it in a paper and sort of this presentation for a sort of student public health thing they were doing. So that was really, really cool. And that was something that was spurred by a student request, but sort of made me even learn something about something that was in my collection that I had otherwise been sort of putting off. Like, it's one of those things where you see it and you're like, oh, that's weird, I'll come back to that, and then never do. So that was really neat.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So in conducting an archival research visit, we've done the ask, maybe we've scheduled a time. What do people do when they get there? What are the do's and don'ts? Are there rules or etiquette recommendations that you have for people ready to dive into their archival visits?
I have two big ones. Well, one, as far as protocol, hopefully the archive will provide you with a list of things, like you have to use a pencil and no food or drink. That seems to be pretty common. Also, guys, bring a sweater. Archives are cold. They are always cold. That's not my recommendation, though. My biggest recommendation is to prioritize. So I have found in all of my years that I will get so excited about the first box that I look at that I needed to look through 20 and I only got through one. It is horrible. It always happens. Time just flies in these archives. And so I think you really need to go in there asking for the most important collection or box, whatever it is, whether that's because you can't find it anywhere else, or you think that's probably most likely to answer your research question. Just because you also don't know if you're in there and you're looking at kind of these peripheral type of materials, and then maybe the archivist is like, oh, we got to close, bye, and you're like, wait, I'm not done. So I do think it's always a good idea to start with the most important things. And then the other big suggestion that I would love to share with future or fellow archive researchers is to write down everything, every single citation, because archives are organized, so meticulously. And so you want to, if I'm writing down, for example, in graduate school, I used a lot of Diana Vreeland's personal archive because I'm sort of obsessed with her. We all love Diana Vreeland, right? And so I was looking through all of her, personal correspondence and stuff, and there was hundreds and hundreds of folders, and each one was in a different box. I remember at one point I had found a letter that was very valuable to my research, and I had forgotten to put the box, or I forgotten to put the folder, and I could never find it again. And so I think that the key to being a good archival researcher, when it comes to paper ephemera, I guess in this case that's what I'm talking about, not objects, is just writing down exactly where you found all these things. Plus it's important for citations later on. But as far as objects, also taking photos of everything, but not just relying on the photos. I think my fellow archivists here can kind of agree here that that is another huge problem that our researchers have, is they come in, they just start taking all these photos and they're like, okay, bye, I'm done. And the entire, knowledge they could have gained just from, physically looking through things slowly. I know I'm thinking about Ingrid Milda's The Slow Approach to Seeing, the Dress Detective book and stuff like that. Like, that does work. And that tends to be how you find these little hidden bits of history and the little aha moments. So yeah, but also bring your camera and make sure it's charged. That's all I have to add.
Those are very tactile, useful tips, I would say. I would, again, just stress this idea of we're in the digital age right now. So, there may not be unlimited funding at the institution or the archive that you're looking to go to, but I'm sure there's, in addition to protocol, so you can have a sense of how the archive's set up, some type of digital resource, so some pre-research that you can do, and utilize that initial contact with the archivist or the curator or collections manager to kind of glean some information so you can help to narrow down and maybe find, get a little bit closer to those needles in the haystack, because again, yeah, the clock is ticking when you're there, and you start to feel a bit like you're on a game show and you're trying to find something and then you not even sure what it is, and you want to make sure that you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's when you're there. But because time starts to get very fluid, I feel like that pre-research can be really important. Not so you can just go in and take 3 pictures and leave, but so maybe you can find those 3 objects or the piece of the archive that you want to concentrate on that's manageable for a single visit. And even ask before you're getting there, I'd like to look through this. How much time would you recommend? Because if they tell you a week or 2 and you have a day, then they won't have to tell you to get a little more specific. You'll know, oh, I should get a little more specific with my ask because I don't have that amount of time. And the sweater is a good idea too. It is cold.
The only thing I would add to that is kind of what Jed is saying with the digital resources. I know for us and more collections, they're putting a portal online for you to search their holdings. So for example, for us and others, we use Past Perfect, and so we have a version online where you can literally search every single artifact in our collection. It doesn't necessarily have a super robust record in terms of many pictures and everything, but it'll give you an idea of what's there, and you can start there in terms of requesting certain artifacts. The other thing I would say is I would even recommend you ask about things like the photo policy before you get there. Generally speaking, it's fine to take photos. I encourage it when people are there, but we also do have you fill out paperwork to tell us what you're going to do with them. So if you're going to do that, it's nice to tell us the kinds of things you're going to use it for specifically, and if you are going to take photos, because then I have the paperwork ready to go and you don't have to stop mid-research and fill that out and everything else. And just be aware, if you're not familiar with artifact handling in museum collections, it's really okay to ask for the curator what their policies are, or just general research. There's a wonderful little tiny book, Caring for Collections, that CSA series put out years and years ago. That'll just to come in with a little knowledge about how to handle things. We love that. So if you know things like, yeah, you're not going to be able to have a beverage. You guys know that, but you have to use a pencil. You're going to need paper, or you can have your laptop, or just anything like that. Just being aware of our policies beforehand. And it's fine to ask, because we're happy to tell you, and it saves us time when you get here. I don't have to go over it. So.
Thank you all very much for those responses. I was not keeping as close an eye on the time as I should have been. So we are at 8:02. We have one more big question for everyone to talk about, and that is the age of COVID. How do you do archival research in the age of COVID? And then we have some questions from the audience. So I apologize, audience, if you have to run, but we've got a little bit more to cover. And so I'm going to thank you for your extra time that we're going to steal from you. So for our esteemed panelists, what are some of the recommendations you have for conducting archival research in the time of COVID? Open to the group.
I mean, from what Marlies said, it sounds like there's going to be limited resources, right? And I think that everyone would kind of understand that. So, whoever's working with the collection is going to essentially be doing their best, but be working in sort of a very unprecedented kind of situation that may have some kind of effect on what your product ends up being if you're writing or researching. So I think just really kind of being patient with that and understanding that they're going to help you in any way they can. It just may take more time.
I would say in terms of, yeah, it is going to take more time. I will say, at least for us, we have been investing more in digital tools. Like digitizing our collection has been a push for OSU for a number of years now. But as you guys probably know, that's very laborious. It's really hard to digitize an entire garment. It's easier to scan paper than it is to dress a mannequin and photograph it all the way around. I think the more specific your question can be, the better. We now I have like a little gimbal thing I mount my phone to, and I can walk people through parts of the archives now if I need to, and I will do that. But know too that if you need that information, you're going to need to tell me so much further in advance because I'm only there 1 day a week. So I have a lot of those to do at a time. I think, so that's one thing. And then I think just it's okay and to be comfortable that you're maybe not, as opposed to if you came in the archive and were able to answer, all your questions at one time, you're maybe going to have to ask one at a time, get an answer, and build out from there. So I think a lot of collections know that it's going to have to go to a digital presence, and just don't be afraid to keep emailing people. Like if you emailed me and you didn't hear from me for a week, I'm not ignoring you probably, and probably is not the archivist or whoever isn't ignoring you either. So just follow up, because a lot of times things are slipping through because we're dealing with a lot right now, especially with trying to communicate with our students and teachers in a distant situation. So don't give up, just keep contacting them. They will get back to you, is what I would say.
Yeah, and I feel like I've been kind of sitting here thinking, because I'm struggling with this myself, because I am now a doctoral student trying to do archival research in the age of COVID. Lucky me. And so I guess two things. One, from like a personal researcher standpoint, I have been so thrilled to see the amount of documents that have been digitized. I have just been, going to town on these different things, but I'm finding there's some pros and cons. The pro being that I can search by a keyword, and a lot of these, historic documents are completely, the full text has been scanned. And so that's really great. But what I'm finding is that I'm missing the things that would be revealed from flipping through the book. So for example, like those etiquette books I was talking about, I am trying to find how women budgeted for clothing. And so it's great, I'm on like archive.org, I can go exactly to the word budget, but then I would have the book itself and I'd be kind of flipping through and I'd be like, oh, what is this chapter? And what's this diagram? So I'm kind of having to force myself to imagine that I'm there physically with the book and to take advantage of the time-saving measures, but like, don't go too crazy. And then the other thing that I've just been kind of telling my students when we switched to online teaching in the spring, and I don't need to tell anybody that, yes, COVID is changing the world, surprise, but I think, you hear about how there's going to be such a shift for businesses, more people working at home just in the future, just kind of reevaluating how human beings work and interact. And I think that's also going to apply to archives. And I don't want to sound pessimistic or anything, but I'm not entirely sure, if the world of archives that I have experienced will ever be the same again, especially for a while, because of, I know I'm such a bummer in this webinar, but in general, it's just like, I feel like I used to be like, oh, I'm going to go hang out with my friends at this archive, and then I'm going to do this and this, and now I'm hearing them all getting furloughed and laid off. And so I do feel like as archivists, we have to just be a lot more savvy with how we do things digitally, as do researchers. So everything that we're kind of saying in this webinar, I think is pretty basic level, and that's where you have to begin. But I am personally now also thinking like, all right, if the next 50 years, if I never get to walk into an archive again, how will I continue doing these things that I love? And it's sort of just, really taking it to the next level. So maybe there'll be a second webinar where we can kind of dive into that. But these are things I'm struggling with myself. So I don't have the answer, sorry.
Thank you all very much. I know that COVID is such a monkey wrench in the works of the archive, and that we're all adapting in different ways. Marlies, I love the idea of the camera on a gimbal and just doing a walkthrough and making it more accessible for people who can't be there. So because we're over on time, I'm so sorry. So thank you so much for all of that information. We're now going to go to questions from the audience. I'm going to I scrolled back through the chat, found a couple that I overlooked before. Do you have any advice for archival studies master's students looking to break into this field?
I can start. I would say intern as much as possible, and then intern again, and then intern. I actually got my first job out of college was in editorial. I worked for Jane Magazine, which kind of just happened with applying. I think I faxed my my resume, and it turned into a job, and everyone there had interned and kind of worked their way up. And I was kind of looking around thinking, oh, I didn't even intern. How did this happen? But when I went back for my master's and I went into archives, That's all I did. And I think that getting the experience wherever you can get it is so important. And then you take that into, you know, a role that's they're going to pay you to do it. Because I mean, so much of it's so subjective, right? Like you're dealing in this really gray area. Do I throw this original document out from the late 1800s, or do I keep it, right? And I remember starting thinking, I don't know how I'm ever going to be able to do any of this, but through experience, you get to be comfortable with it, and then you can make way for researchers to be able to find the things that they need to find, because you can kind of weed out the things that, you know, aren't going to be useful.
I would say for me, not to like be a homer and toot CSA's horn, but like uh, the networking I've through a professional organization is invaluable. I mean, and I don't even mean like you go and like fake schmooze with people, because that's gross and no fun. Just like, because like we said, like archivists and curators and basically almost everyone I've met in this field is super wonderful and nice and genuinely interested in basically everybody else's research. So even just going and getting to know people, and then you can talk to them and tell them like, hey, I'm looking to get into this field, or have you heard of openings? And we generally have, or we know who's maybe thinking about retiring, because you know that's part of the game. So it's just sort of, you know, just networking, and it's good for you anyway, because you'll remember things like, oh, I remember so and so has this collection, and they said they have this archive, blah blah blah. So I would say interning for sure. Like my internship was at the Cincinnati Art Museum, and that was invaluable. But also just networking. You don't have, and don't be intimidated if you're a recent grad or you're new in the field. Like to me, I never felt like when I went places that it was like, oh, well, do you have your PhD? It's like, meh. You know, so I think everybody's really open and nobody feels like the hierarchy there. I mean, I know for those of us who are maybe housed in traditional academic, you know how that can be. But like, it's not like that. So I think going and just making friends and getting to know people so that you can sort of do that casual networking is also really important, because this is a particularly kind of small group, and you're going to end up knowing everybody anyway.
I mean, I would just second what these two wonderful archivists have said, but on top of that, I mean, there's just such trouble with interning, right? We talk about this more and more about who can afford to do it, who is left out, how is this by. So I feel like a part of me is like, just do a bunch of internships, but then it's like, it's not easy for everyone. So I think that, you know, I mentioned earlier, the great woman I worked with, Julie, who I was doing some corporate archiving with, and although that wasn't, you know, it was very quick. It was just building a designer's inspiration archive, which is a bunch of, you know, vintage clothes to peruse, to look at, not actually the designer's own. But anyways, I got amazing experience doing that. You know, you're taking a photo, you're describing, you're doing cataloging, and I got all this terminology. And of course, I had to do a lot of extra work on the side too, to kind of build up that more academic scholarship type of knowledge of archival work, but it paid. And it was good, and I met some friends, and those friends worked at museums, and then they helped me get to the places. So yeah, I think it's like not necessarily just limiting yourself to like, I have to work at either a brand archive or I have to work at these, you know, university. It's also just like, well, who's hiring someone to catalog? Like, oh, hey, random old lady, sure, I'll come catalog your Birkin bags, you know, if you're good enough for that, if you know Birkin bags, of course. But yeah, so I think it's tough. You don't want to limit yourself too much.
Excellent advice. Thank you so much, everyone. We are at time, and unfortunately, we have to wrap this up. But if you would like more content like this, let us know at conversationsondress@costumesocietyamerica.com. And as part of tonight's presentation, we put together a brief list of suggested readings on archival research, not meant to be exhaustive, but just a place to start. All right, on behalf of the Costume Society of America, I'd like to thank our esteemed panel of experts for joining us this evening, and thank you to the audience for joining in.